the thing I thought we could talk about tonight, because you brought it up and I have it ready to go, is this one example of one of these great hydraulic or fluvial events that occurred that seemed to characterize this transition from glacial to interglacial age. And we still don't know, really. I mean, we speculate. I think I have some ideas on that. But, the thing about a glacial age, when glacial age comes on, unless there's some external force to pull the plug on it, it should be self-perpetuating. Because, look, it's a matter of albedo. When when you have what you don't wear, if it's really hot out, you don't wear black clothes, do you? You don't wear a black shirt, you wear a white shirt. Why? Because white reflects the heat and black absorbs it. The darker it is, the more heat it's going to absorb. The lighter it is, the more it's going to reflect. So if you have the onset of an ice age, and I was just reading about just the Fennoscandian ice sheet the other day, it was 4 million square kilometers in extent. That means that 4 million square kilometers of Europe was covered under snow that then became glacial ice. So all of that is reflecting heat back into space. Let's see what we could convert 4 million to that's about 1 million square miles, I guess, roughly. And but in North America, we had 6 million square miles covered. So what is that doing? That completely changes the albedo balance of the northern hemisphere. Right? It's reflecting all of this heat back into space. So the more the glacier grows, the more heat it's reflecting. It seems like it should be a perpetual, mutually reinforcing feedback loop that's going on.
Right.
But something interrupts that.
Something has to disrupt it. Yeah.
Something has to disrupt it. Or you've heard of ice house Earth at that time way in the distant past, long before humans, when it looked like the whole planet was engulfed in an ice age, right? So there seems to be the consequence of this runaway feedback of a self-perpetuating glacier age, right? But we've seen at least 4 or 5 glacier cycles come and go in the last, 500,000 years, and it hasn't done that. It hasn't caused a runaway ice house that's caused the whole Earth to become locked down in glaciers. What happened in the most recent one? Well, that's the question. What happened, say, between 11 and 14, 15,000 years ago that brought the great ice sheet to an end and caused this rapid melting away of the ice sheet? Now, one of the things, we know it's rapid because we can see rapid sea level rise. In fact, there are CREs, catastrophic rise events. There were probably 3 of them. In other words, think about a 420-foot lower sea level at 15,000 years ago and now current levels, right? So that rise was not a uniform phenomenon. It was pulsed 2, 3. And then at the end of that, it actually overshot modern levels by 6, 7, 8 feet. Like 4,000, 5,000 years ago, and then settled back down to the modern, and actually went a little lower, and then has come back up, and now it's 8 inches higher than it was at the end of the 1800s. But so you have these catastrophic rise events, and they then, if they're associated with melting away of the glaciers, that meltwater now is either flowing directly off the glaciers into the global oceans, like it did particularly like on the west coast of the mountains of British Columbia, right? Because you had during the height of the Ice Age, they were all completely covered in ice. You had ice literally calving into the Pacific Ocean, right? Go to the East Coast, same thing. You had icebergs calving into the North Atlantic, So basically, if the ice is rapidly melting, that water is pouring directly into the ocean basins. However, what did you have, like 6,000 or 7,000 miles? Maybe 3,000 or 4,000 miles. Of course, if you followed the irregularities of it, you had a glacier that reached from Washington State to New England that all headed onto land. So that melting has to traverse the land before on its way back to the ocean. And that's where it leaves these extraordinary calling cards in the wake of its passage. So the Bonneville flood was one of those events. But what's unique about the Bonneville flood, unlike when we look at the flooding earlier, you and we were talking, I told you about the discharge that created the Missouri River Valley, right? Well, we can look at the Columbia River, the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, the Hudson River, the Connecticut River. All of those rivers, their headwaters are now where the glaciers were, okay? But if you look at, for example, more southern rivers like the Rio Grande River, for example, or the Colorado River, they did not head onto the Great Glacier Mass themselves, okay? And yet they show evidence of catastrophic flooding. Now, the Snake River that we're going to talk about now, it rose, you would say, near the Grand Teton Dams, Grand Teton Mountains, which, of course, during the Ice Age had a whole lot more glaciers than are there now, obviously. But there was enough water that came down through the Snake River that it completely outsized the flow of the modern Snake River. And it actually, the great flood that came through there is known as the Great Bonneville Flood. It actually started in Utah, Lake Bonneville. So why don't we get right into it here? I have some great imagery here. Yeah, let's do that. I'll go
to draw one comparison to what you're saying, because it touches on what we were talking about earlier. Even something as small in comparison to these cataclysmic events, like some type of solar event happening and overgrazing of the topsoil and the Great Depression coming on. I mean, look how devastating that was to a society, to our society. Something so small. Imagine an event like this happening.
Exactly. I mean, that's exactly where you're going with your thinking, Beck. It is exactly the direction it needs to go. And it's not like, if you're invested in certain prophetic beliefs or whatever, and you believe there's Armageddon is a foregone conclusion. I mean, I know that in some of the great catastrophes, when you look at the human stories of those, like I'll cite, for example, the Great Peshtigo Fire of 1871 that probably killed somewhere around 2,000 people. The greatest natural forest fire disaster in American history, right? Well, you had a lot of the people that were, destroyed in that fire that lived up there along Green Bay, Wisconsin, where this fire occurred, were very religious, and they they knew about the whole prophecies and all of that, the idea that of the apocalypse and the judgment day, etc. So a lot of these people, when this whole thing came on, they had time that they could have escaped, but they didn't because they thought it was futile. They believed that this was Judgment Day and this was the end of the world. And so they just passively gave in, and they were destroyed. Now, had they taken a little initiative and run a half a mile and submerged themselves in the river, they could have survived.
Yeah.
But they thought, this is it. This is the end.
That ideology didn't work for you there. No.
That ideology did not work so well there. And there are lessons to be extracted for sure from these microcosmic scale catastrophes that happen, for sure. So it'd be very valuable to look at some of those.
Yeah, they're nice little warning shots for us.
Yes.
And they're so serious. Like, still, our experience of them, although they might be confined to a smaller geographic area, I mean, you hear about these things and it's sad. Like the fires that are happening in California, I think they're still happening in California. The whole country is there's a different mood about it when it's talked about, and it's so devastating to a society. This would be completely different scales. And I know we're about to look at what that actually, the evidence of that, where there wasn't, and we'll see the people who live there now as we look through Google Earth or whatever maps, we'll see exactly who would have been affected.
Well, let's launch into it then. So Harold Mauld, U.S. Geological Survey, 1968, he was the first one. and because of what he saw, he gave eyes to the rest of us. The enormous size of the depositional and erosional features produced by the Bonneville flood imply a peak discharge of extraordinary volume. So nobody before him that I know of really, I'm guessing Native Americans probably had traditions of the flood. I'm sure they did, but they weren't part of the scientific discourse on the geomorphological history of North America. So here, 1991, Quaternary stratigraphic. Quaternary is the last 2.5 million years. Stratigraphic, hydrologic, and climatic history of the Great Basin, with emphasis on lakes Lahontan, Bonneville, and Tecopa. And this was published in 1991. Nearly all closed or formerly closed basins in the Great Basin have ancient strand lines marked by lacustrine bars, spits, embankments, terraces, deltas, and wave-cut cliffs at elevations well above the playas or permanent lakes of today. Let's mark. What is a strand line? Well, it's a shoreline. What is lacustrine? That means lake, right? There was a lake there. And all of these associated things like spits, embankments, terraces, deltas that would be associated, wave-cut cliffs. Now, normally a static lake doesn't cut cliffs. You have to have waves, right? And energetic waves. Then you can cut cliffs. And at elevations well above the playas or permanent lakes. Now, a playa lake in the desert is an ephemeral lake. During rainy periods, it'll form, and during dry periods, it'll evaporate away. So it's not always there. So both, as it's saying here, playas or permanent lakes of today. So in other words, these ancient lakes show evidence of being much deeper and higher up than the modern lakes. The impressive shore features of Lake Lahontan and Bonneville prompted their study by the U.S. Geological Survey more than a century ago. About 120 pluvial lakes existed within the Great Basin during Wisconsin time. Here's the Great Basin. See this? It's almost a circular feature, which suggests to me that it's probably the remnant of some very, very ancient giant impact that occurred early in the Earth's history. And then you've got all of these folded mountain ranges in here. But then what's interesting here is the areas between the lowlands, the range. This is the basin and the range. So it's the mountain range interspersed with these basins. And the floors of the basins are flat for the most part, right? This is the Bonneville Basin here. Have you ever heard of the Bonneville Salt Flats, where high-performance racing cars are tested? Mm-hmm. That's right out here on this big space zone right here. This is modern Great Salt Lake, which is a mere puddle remnant left over from late glacial Lake Bonneville. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to show you that what you're about to see is not necessarily that all these bodies of water were simultaneous. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But the point is this is going to show you everywhere where there have been enormous, deep water over the Great Basin Range. Bonneville was up in here.
So how deep would Bonneville be at that time?
It was about 1,000 feet. So Lake Bonneville became the largest pluvial lake in the Western Hemisphere about 17 to 15,000 years ago. I think it was probably later than that. We can discuss that. But at its maximum, it inundated several coalescent intermontane, in between the mountains, basins in northwest Utah extending into Idaho and Nevada, an area of about 51,700 square kilometers, also almost the area of Lake Michigan, and had a maximum depth of about 315 meters. Today, the only permanent lakes are Great Salt and Utah lakes. Lake Bonneville's history remains controversial. Nearly every serious researcher on Lake Bonneville since Gilbert has come up with a different interpretation. And so, so 315 meters is 1,033 feet. And Great Salt Lake now is, I don't know if it's over 2 or 3 feet deep. It's very, very shallow. Mm-hmm. 51,700 square kilometers is almost basically 20,000 square miles.
It's massive.
So that's big enough that if you were going to paddle across it, you couldn't see the other side, and when you were in the middle of it, you basically wouldn't see the shorelines.
Mm-hmm.
That's how big it was. And you're going to be paddling over a body of water 1,000 feet deep. That's pretty where it's desert now, basically. So just think about that. Just let that sink in. See? Here's the thing. The dominant dialogue now that's being perpetrated mainly through mainstream media and so on, and academia, is not acknowledging this scale of change that we're talking about here.
It's just small degrees of change that they want to acknowledge, and then anything beyond that gets a little turned head and poo-poo to it.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's go on. So here's a digital map of northern Bonneville Basin. Here's Great Salt Lake. And then this is the Snake River Plain here. And it's all basalt, young basalts that go back roughly that mostly extruded between about 17 million and 6 million years ago. Still active on its east end up here, because up here is where Yellowstone is. And Yellowstone sits over a magma plume. And the whole southeast base, the whole Snake River Basin here is the pathway of the moving North American plate moving over this hot spot, this upwelling magma plume.
Is that why you get like a lot of hot springs out there?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, that's exactly right. So here's a map of Lake Bonneville. The dashed line here that you see is Great Salt Lake. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Here? Right. So you can see that it at its deepest it passed up into southern Idaho. Okay, so it turned out that, there's one of the things you got to keep in mind here is there's no outlet to the ocean. It's an enclosed basin, right? Until it got 1,000 feet deep. Once it got 1,000 feet deep, what it did was it started spilling over the lowest mountain pass that was on the whole perimeter of and it happened to be up here in the north. So here's Great Salt Lake, and here is Lake Bonneville, and right here is where the spillway occurred. Right? Can you see where my cursor is?
Yeah.
So that's called Red Rock Pass. So it overtopped this spillway and quickly eroded about 350 feet of relatively soft sedimentary rock, and the lake level dropped about 350 feet very rapidly, probably over a period of 2 to 6 months it took for the uppermost 350 feet of the lake level to drop. And then underneath that soft sedimentary rock was a very hard granite sill. So the water started pouring over the top of the sedimentary rock and then quickly ate it down. When it hit the granite sill, it stabilized. Right? Now you had a semi-permanent lake there, but in the aftermath of all the great changes that were occurring on the earth at that time, this went from a rather temperate zone to an arid zone, and then the water slowly, over a period of millennia that was retained in that basin, evaporated away until all that was left was a puddle, which is now the Great Salt Lake. On the Wasatch Mountains, you can see the high water line, and you can see where it dropped. So this is an aerial view shot that I took flying over. This is the Wasatch Mountains, and all of this down here, this transition, represents the shoreline of Lake Bonneville. Right? And of course you see all of this would have been 1,000 feet underwater. Right.
Wow.
Where Great Salt Lake City is now, that would have been 900 to 1,000 feet underwater. So that shows roughly the lake.